I'm going to talk about my own personal experiences as what you might call an accidental and reluctant figure in the larger debate over climate change, and the lessons that I think I've learned from these experiences. Before I do that, I do want to sort of hit some of the key points on the science, sort of a brief recap of what you've mostly already heard from Stefan. First of all, the greenhouse effect, the basic science of climate change. It's not controversial science. It's not new science. We've known about this for nearly 2 centuries. The fact that certain gases in the atmosphere, like CO2, have a warming influence on the surface of the Earth, it goes back to Joseph Fourier, the same scientist who discovered the law of heat conduction. That's how long we've known about the basic science, and we've mostly just been refining our understanding of the details over time. As you've also seen, there's no question that we are increasing the concentrations of these gases in the atmosphere. As Gudni mentioned, even before I was born, President Johnson was already announcing to the American people that we were engaged in this unprecedented experiment with the way that we are burning fossil fuels and engaged in other activities that are elevating the concentrations of these gases. This graph is a couple years old, but it already needs a whole new tick mark, because we crossed 400 parts per million for the first time earlier this year. There is evidence that you probably have to go back several million years in time to find CO2 concentrations that were that high naturally. So that gives you some idea of how unprecedented these changes are. So there's no question about the greenhouse effect. It's basic chemistry and physics we've known for nearly 2 centuries. No question that we're increasing the concentrations of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. What Stefan and I would not be able to explain to you today would be if the Earth were not warming up as a result of that. And of course, as you've seen, the globe has warmed up a little less than a degree Celsius, and we're likely to see, of course, much more warming in the future if we continue with business as usual. Now, the critics may tell you they don't trust the thermometer records. They don't trust the estimates of global temperatures derived from thermometers around the world over the past century and a half. But as Stefan already showed you, there are dozens of independent lines of evidence that tell us the planet is warming, the climate is changing, much in the way that we expect it to, as we continue to increase the concentrations of these gases in the atmosphere. And none of that is based on climate models. Another favorite talking point of climate change contrarians or climate change deniers is that the entire science of global warming is based on these climate models, these untrustworthy climate models. And that claim is doubly wrong because there's reason to trust them, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But the evidence isn't based on climate models. In the first couple minutes of this lecture, I explained to you the overwhelming evidence for a human influence on our climate. And it comes from basic physical principles we've known about for nearly 2 centuries, irrefutable measurements that tell us that we are changing the composition of the atmosphere in an unprecedented way, and measurements that confirm that we are, in fact, seeing the warming that we expect. Now, we do use climate models to test various hypotheses. After all, there's only one climate system, and we are already engaged in an unprecedented experiment with that climate system. But if we want to play other experiments, if we want to test hypotheses, for example, what might have happened to the climate if we hadn't increased greenhouse gas concentrations over the past 2 centuries, if we want to pose questions like that and test them, we need to use physical models that formalize our understanding of the physics and the chemistry and even the biology that governs this system. So we construct these models, these elaborate models of the climate system. Now, some of you may recognize this location. How many people in this room recognize that restaurant? Okay. Anybody want to tell me what TV show that was from? Seinfeld show, exactly. Went on the air in 1991. 3 years before the Seinfeld show went on the air, back in 1988, Dr. James Hansen of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, which sits in the upper floors of this building. I did a sabbatical there about 10 years ago. So I was going to the Seinfeld diner to work every day for about a year. And it was quite a bit of fun. But in the upper floors of that building, James Hansen, back in 1988, was running a climate model which by today's standards, for example, compared to the climate model results that Stefan showed you earlier. It was an extremely primitive model by today's standards. But he was making predictions using that climate model. And as Niels Bohr once famously said, predictions are hard, especially about the future. And what Hansen did was to make a prediction about the future back in 1988. There you can see the thermometer records recording the warming that had been seen over the past few decades. He ran his climate model 3 different times. And as Stefan said, when you run a climate model, there's a certain random component. Just like there's a random component in the weather, there's a random component in the climate. You know, El Niños come and go naturally, and they're unpredictable. And so you don't get exactly the same answer if you run the model several different times. But each of those simulations did a pretty good job capturing the warming that had been seen up to that point. And then he projected forward under 3 different possible scenarios. After all, one thing Hansen couldn't have predicted is what we would choose to do. Would we choose to greatly curtail our burning of fossil fuels? That's the purple. Would we choose to greatly increase our rate of fossil fuel burning, even beyond historical patterns? That's the green. Or would we be somewhere in between? That's the blue. Well, it turns out if you look at the actual fossil fuel emissions that we have made in the intervening decades, we've fallen most closely on the pathway that was envisioned in this middle scenario B. So that's Hansen's prediction of the warming we should have seen given the emissions that we have actually made of carbon into the atmosphere. And that's what the thermometer records show happened over the ensuing 2 decades. I would argue a pretty good prediction of the warming far in advance, a pretty impressive successful test of a climate model. Now, if you're a critic, you might see the glass as half empty rather than half full. You might say, well, if this climate model, this blue climate model here is so good, how could it possibly have missed this huge signal, this huge cooling that we saw in 1991, 1992, 1993? If the model's so great, how come it couldn't predict that? And it is true that James Hansen could not predict in 1988 that in 1991, Mount Pinatubo would erupt. And when it did, it would put large amounts of reflective particulates into the stratosphere, blocking out some of the incoming sunlight and cooling the planet by about 0.5 degree for several years. What Hansen did know is that it takes 6 to 9 months for that volcanic cloud to spread around the global stratosphere and begin to have a cooling effect. That gave him just enough time to do another climate model simulation and make a prediction of the cooling that we would expect. And he predicted we should see about 0.5 degree C cooling for several years. It was actually another very successful test of a climate model that, again, was quite primitive by the standards of the climate models we actually use today. So let's test some hypotheses using those models. Again, if you're a critic, you might say, well, okay, you know, maybe the globe is warmed, I'll grant you that. But how do we know it's not due to those natural factors, like those volcanic eruptions you talked about? Or, you know, as Stefan said, there are small but measurable changes in solar output over time that influence the surface temperature of the Earth. How do we know that that warming wasn't due to those natural factors? Well, let's take the climate models. We actually have good estimates of the volcanic forcing over the past 100, 150 years. We have good estimates of solar output changes from satellites over the past few decades and from information from for example, sunspot data or cosmogenic isotope data. We can extend that record back in time as well, and we can drive the climate model with just the natural factors. And when we do that, we've got a problem. The Earth actually should have cooled slightly over the past few decades if it were primarily the natural factors that were at work. It is indeed only when we include the human factor, in particular, of increasing greenhouse gas concentrations from fossil fuel burning and other activities, that we can explain the warming that we've seen. So there's reason to take these climate models quite seriously. They've been validated a number of ways, and they are telling us that we cannot explain the warming we've already seen from natural causes. We've detected the fingerprint of humans on the climate. So what about our future? What about projecting forward from here? And again, Stefan already talked about that. You know, if we got very serious about the problem right now, as this shows, we could easily stabilize warming below 2 degrees C. Now this scale starts out at about -1 if you go back to the pre-industrial period. So +1 on this scale is that 2 degrees C warming threshold that Stefan talked about. That threshold where most scientists who study the impacts of climate change will tell you that's when we start to get into the realm of truly dangerous and potentially irreversible changes in our climate. Well, we would avoid that in all likelihood if we got serious about that problem now. There's great urgency, but there's still reason for optimism. We can still do this. On the other hand, if we neglect the warnings that we are seeing and we just continue with business as usual fossil fuel emissions, then we're going to be on that red curve. And let me shade that a little bit because there's some uncertainty. Not all climate models have, for example, the same climate sensitivity as Stefan was talking about. They don't represent all of the processes in precisely the same way. So there's some uncertainty about precisely how much warming we get, but we're talking somewhere in the realm of 4 to 5 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial time. For this crowd, I won't do the Fahrenheit translation, which I usually do when I give this lecture back in the States. 4 to 5 degrees Celsius warming of the planet. Twice that much for the Arctic because of some of the amplifying factors like the melting of ice and the increased absorption of sunlight by the Arctic Ocean. Well, in that scenario, you know, in the words of James Hansen, who I mentioned earlier, we will be leaving our children and grandchildren a fundamentally different planet. It's not going to be the planet that we grew up on. And we've already seen some discussion of the precise impacts that we think climate change will have on us, on our environment, on ecosystems. Again, if we continue with business as usual. So, you might well ask, if the science is this clear, if the threat is this obvious, why has there been no serious effort at an international level to deal with this problem in a meaningful way? And that is, of course, where we leave the realm of science in this talk and we get into the matter of politics and the politics of climate change. Well, you know, there is a vast infrastructure worldwide, including here in Iceland to some extent, for getting our energy from fossil fuels. In the words of former President George W. Bush, former US President George W. Bush, we are addicted to fossil fuels. Yes, that was George W. Bush who said that. We are addicted to fossil fuels. And we have a huge infrastructure for getting our energy from fossil fuels. And whenever you have a huge infrastructure, there's an associated power structure. And the fossil fuel industry is pretty happy with our current addiction to fossil fuels. Understandably, they don't want to see that change. And unfortunately, that means in some instances they have chosen to poison this public discussion about the threat of climate change and what to do about it. Now in the US, back in 2002, there's a well-known pollster for the Republican Party, Frank Luntz, and he had written a memo to his clients, essentially fossil fuel interests in the US, that got leaked. That memo got leaked. It wasn't supposed to be seen by the public, I promise you. And what that memo basically said was that from his polling, from the focus groups that he had been doing, it was clear to him that there was a closing window of opportunity for fossil fuel interests. The public, the American public, was becoming convinced that there was now a scientific consensus about human-caused climate change. And if they were to become convinced that there was a scientific consensus, they would demand policy action. They would demand action be taken. But, he said, there is still a narrow window still left to insert doubt and confusion into the public discourse, to fund front groups with fancy-sounding names whose sole purpose is to confuse the public about the science, to attack the science, to attack individual scientists. And that is indeed not such a new tactic. It's exactly what the tobacco industry did decades ago. When faced with scientific evidence that their product was linked to adverse health impacts on human beings, tobacco products, cigarettes, lung cancer, some of the same lobbyists, some of the same front groups, some of the same scientific advocates who were working for the tobacco industry decades ago to claim that there was no linkage between tobacco and human health are now working for the fossil fuel industry to try to convince you that there's no linkage between the burning of fossil fuels and the health not of individual humans, but the entire planet. So we have powerful politicians in the US, like Senator James Inhofe of the hottest state ever in the US. As of 2 summers ago, Oklahoma became the hottest state ever. And James Inhofe was still claiming that, powerful US senator was claiming that climate change was the most elaborate hoax ever perpetrated on the American people. And so thousands of scientists around the world had engaged in this elaborate hoax, and somehow they had gotten the oceans and the ice sheets and global temperatures to play along with this hoax. It's a remarkable claim. It's of course an absurd claim, but these sorts of claims are coming from the highest level. And so it's not surprising that James Inhofe that summer was invited to be the keynote speaker at the Heartland Institute's annual Climate Change Denial Conference. The Heartland Institute is an industry-funded front group that was advocating for the tobacco industry decades ago and is now working for the fossil fuel industry. And every year they have a conference, quote unquote, conference, bringing together lobbyists and non-scientists to talk about how climate change is a hoax and we don't have to worry about it. And they invited James Inhofe to be their keynote speaker that year. Sadly, he had to cancel out at the last minute. He had gotten sick swimming in a lake back in his home state of Oklahoma. The lake was suffering from an algal bloom as a result of the unprecedented heat and drought that Oklahoma was experiencing at that time. And so James Inhofe had to cancel out. Well, how did I find myself in the center of this circus atmosphere that we have in the US and elsewhere when it comes to climate change? As you already know, as I've alluded to, it's because of this graph that my colleagues and I published a decade and a half ago that came to be known as the hockey stick curve. It was our attempt to estimate how temperatures had varied over the more distant past. We only have about a century or so of widespread thermometer records, so if we want to get a sense of how unusual this modern warming is, it's sort of hard to see the instrumental record, but it goes up to about here. We need to turn to what we call proxy data, like tree rings and coral records, ice cores, to piece together this puzzle of how did the climate change in the more distant past. And we came up with this curve. It showed the modern warming to be without precedent as far back as we could go, 1,000 years at the time. It got a name because of its shape, the hockey stick. And it was featured prominently in the summary for policymakers of the 2001 IPCC report, and it quickly became an icon in the climate change debate because it told a pretty simple picture. You didn't have to understand the intricacies of climate science to realize what this curve was telling you, that there is something unprecedented about this warming that takes place coincidentally with industrialization, and it probably has something to do with us. So, because this became an icon in the climate change debate, it was fiercely attacked by those to whom this iconic result was a threat because it conveyed a simple truth about the climate system to the public. It was attacked fiercely. It continues to be attacked, even though there's a veritable hockey league now. Dozens of reconstructions that have been done using different types of data, different statistical methods, and they don't agree on all the details. For example, precisely how warm was the medieval period, precisely how cold was the Little Ice Age. But they all agree on the fact that the recent warming is unprecedented over at least the past millennium and probably further. Just a week ago, the IPCC published their 5th assessment report, Summary for Policymakers. They extended this conclusion back now 1,400 years. But you know, there were some monkey wrenches that were thrown in to the problem recently. There was a study that was published in the journal Nature Geoscience just months ago, the most comprehensive study of this sort yet. I think something like 80 scientists from 40-something institutions, from 20-something different countries around the world using the most comprehensive paleoclimate data set, independently performed a reconstruction of the past 1,000 years. And in a huge surprise, they ended up completely overthrown. Oh, no, sorry. Yeah, actually, they got the same result we did 15 years ago. Well, as Stefan showed you, there are other efforts to extend these results back even further, and they use sort of fuzzier lines of evidence, less precise data, so the uncertainties are a lot larger, and the studies can't resolve sort of the individual year-to-year fluctuations, but they can estimate the larger trends, and it appears that that warming spike is potentially without precedent over the entire period since the end of the last ice age, the entire Holocene period. And of course, the last ice age was even colder. So that means that this modern warming spike may be unprecedented over more than the past 100,000 years. But this is a misleading way to plot this data, because what we really want to ask is, well, you know, how unusual is the warming we're likely to see over the next century if we continue with business as usual fossil fuel emissions? And that's what that looks like. That's where we'll be at the end of this century, according to the best climate models that we have, if we continue with business as usual. This mid-Holocene warm period is barely a blip on the scale of the warming we're talking about. Again, an unprecedented change in the climate system. So, again, you know, the hockey stick has been attacked. The science of climate change continues to be attacked. It's part of what some people would call the politicization of science today, although I prefer a different term. I call it the scientization of politics, which to me is something even more pernicious. Especially in the US, we are now seeing science used or abused as just another way of waging politics. We sort of live in a fact-free world in the US where, you know, if you don't like the conclusions of the IPCC, if you don't like the conclusions of the National Academy of Sciences, founded by Abraham Lincoln back in the mid-19th century, a Republican president, if you don't like the conclusions of the national academies of all of the major industrial nations, or all the scientific societies in the US and Canada and Europe who have weighed in on the science of climate change, all of whom have come to the conclusion that the planet is warming, it's due to human activity, and it represents a threat if we don't do something about it. If you don't like those conclusions, in the US, there's a whole cable network for you. There are radio shows and editorial pages, some leading newspapers, which are more than happy to provide an alternative universe where, you know, the laws of physics don't apply in the way that we thought they did. And increasingly, people are able to reinforce their own misconceptions, their own preconceptions, by simply choosing to tune into some of these contrarian sources of information. And it sort of highlights a famous phrase by a great American politician. He was a senator from New York named Daniel P. Moynihan. He was sort of the intellect of the US Senate, one of the great intellects of our entire political history. And he famously said, "You're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts." And unfortunately today in America and elsewhere, there are people who feel that they're entitled to their own facts when it comes to matters like climate change. And so we have, you know, I have been attacked by powerful politicians like Joe Barton, who you may know, well, okay, back in 2005, as I was getting ready to leave the University of Virginia for a new position at Penn State University in Pennsylvania, I got a letter from Joe Barton, and it was, it was a subpoena. It was a subpoena demanding all of my personal emails, all of my documents from my entire career, all the documents and emails of my two senior co-authors whose careers went back decades, because he had read a criticism of our influential hockey stick study in a very prestigious journal, the Wall Street Journal, editorial pages. And he saw this as a cause for engaging in an open-ended fishing expedition to go through all my personal emails and all my colleagues' emails and try to find something, presumably to embarrass us, to discredit us, so that he could discredit the hockey stick and his supporters. By the way, I'm sure it was a coincidence. He was the largest recipient in the US House of Representatives of fossil fuel money. Well, turns out this was before Joe Barton became a famous name. You may have heard his name back in 2010. He famously apologized to BP on the part of the US for them having dumped a whole lot of oil into our Gulf of Mexico. He decided that we should be apologizing to them. And he was widely mocked for that. This was 5 years earlier, and this attack against us didn't get quite the media attention that his infamous apology to BP got 5 years later. But it did get quite a bit of attention from the scientific community. The AAAS, who published the journal Science, condemned this obvious effort to intimidate scientists whose findings might not be convenient to the special interests that fund Joe Barton's campaigns. The American Geophysical Union, the American Meteorological Society, the journal Nature editorialized on this, denouncing this attack, what they saw as an attack on science. Editorials in leading newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, even what you might have thought would be the more fossil fuel friendly Houston, Texas Chronicle, called out Barton's actions in very harsh terms. Now, it might not be surprising to you that a Democrat like Henry Waxman from California, who led the effort to bring the tobacco industry to justice for hiding the effects of their product decades ago, you might not be surprised that he would come out to defend my colleagues and me when we were under attack. What might surprise those of you who are familiar with American politics is that the biggest hero turns out to have been a Republican. It was the chair of the House Science Committee, Sherwood Boehlert, who was what we would call an old school, pro-science, pro-environment Republican, sort of in the mold of Teddy Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln. And he called out his fellow Republican Joe Barton's attack on us in the harshest terms of anybody. And he wasn't the only prominent Republican. You might recognize that guy there. He was running for president some years ago. John McCain wrote an op-ed in the Chronicle of Higher Education, a publication in the US, where he said, this attack on us, it represents a kind of intimidation which threatens the relationship between science and public policy. That behavior must not be tolerated. Almost unprecedented in modern American politics for a Republican to so publicly call out another fellow Republican in these terms. It's really quite remarkable. It didn't stop there, and hey, I haven't said anything yet. So, in December 2009, as many of you know, was the Copenhagen Summit, the first opportunity in years for meaningful progress in dealing with the threat of human-caused climate change. And in the lead-up to that summit, suddenly there was a scandal, a massive scandal, Climategate, thousands of emails, which, by the way, were stolen from a university in the UK, which had been combed through, and individual words and phrases from those emails were taken out of context and they were plastered onto news network screens, the Fox News, the Rush Limbaugh show, sort of the conservative media of the US, the Murdoch media empire worldwide, trumpeted this supposed scandal, these leaked emails, actually stolen emails, which supposedly revealed that climate change was indeed a vast hoax, that climate scientists had been fudging the data. And that was based on a rather disingenuous cherry picking of individual words and phrases that were taken out of context from these emails to try to make it sound like scientists had been, fudging the data, lying about climate change. And in an op-ed in the Washington Post on December 9, again, right in the lead up of Copenhagen, Sarah Palin claimed that these emails revealed, among other things, that climate experts had manipulated data to hide the decline in global temperatures. Hide the decline in global temperatures. Well, this is a remarkable claim because the email she was referring to was from a colleague of mine in the UK. It was written in early 1999, which, as you know now, was on the heels of the warmest year we had ever seen. 1998 was this huge spike because of a very large El Nino event. It was the warmest year we had ever seen. And in early 1999, the only thing climate scientists could have been talking about was the apparent acceleration of global warming. How could they have been talking about hiding the decline in global temperature? There was no decline in global temperature. Turns out The scientist was referring to some bad data. They had published an article in the journal Nature a year earlier about this one particular data set that they had been looking at, a type of tree ring information that records temperature variations very well up until 1960. In the 1960s, there's some other factors that set in, and they cause these trees to no longer be reliable recorders of climate. And in their paper, they talked about this problem, which has come to be known as the divergence problem, and how these data should not be used after the 1960s to depict temperature trends. So he was talking about removing the bad data from this plot so it wouldn't mislead the readers of this report. It was for the cover of a report. And so I explained this and some of the other things that Sarah Palin got wrong in my own op-ed in the Washington Post 9 days later. And it even seems to have convinced Sarah Palin herself, because just a couple years ago, and these are her words, okay? A lot of those emails obviously weren't meant for public consumption. And they could be misinterpreted, she said, if they were taken out of context, okay? Of course, she was referring to her own emails that had been released in response to a Freedom of Information Act request. The attacks didn't stop there. James Inhofe, who you'll remember now. How many people in this room have seen the movie The Manchurian Candidate? A fair number of people. You remember there's a list of 57 members of the US Congress who are known members of the Communist Party. It was a McCarthy-like figure in this movie, and he was being criticized by his wife because every time he claimed that there were all these communists in the US Congress, he could never agree on the number. And so you see in the scene, as it ends, there's a bottle of Heinz 57 ketchup. And in the next scene, you see him announcing on the Senate floor that there are exactly 57 communists in the US House of Representatives. Well, Inhofe couldn't come up with 57 climate scientists, but he did find 17 climate scientists who should be prosecuted for perpetrating the hoax of human-caused climate change, as revealed supposedly by these emails. And I'm proud to say I was a member of that list of 17, along with Susan Solomon, who was the recipient of the Presidential Medal of Science, the highest scientific honor in the US. It didn't stop there. Newly minted Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli of Virginia, who's now running for governor of Virginia. I've been campaigning for his opponent. I've appeared in some of his commercials. Ken Cuccinelli was this newly minted Attorney General of Virginia, what we would call a Tea Party Republican, extreme conservative, far-right Republican. And his first act as Attorney General in 2010 was to, his first act as Attorney General, he wanted to change the official state seal of Virginia because it exposed a certain part of the anatomy of the Roman goddess Virtus. He felt that that was not family-friendly. Virginia needed a more family-friendly insignia, so he wanted to change. That was his first. Sorry, it was his second act as Attorney General was to take a page from the Joe Barton playbook and try to use a civil subpoena available to the Attorney General to ferret out, to get rid of state waste and fraud. It's actually there in the laws for dealing with Medicare fraud. But his argument was, when I was at the University of Virginia for 6 years and working on the science of climate change, which is clearly fraudulent science, it was only appropriate for him to try to issue a subpoena to the University of Virginia demanding all my personal emails with more than 30 scientists around the world so that he could prove that there was fraud involved here. The scientific community wasn't convinced. Major public policy organizations, even a conservative group, FIRE, denounced these actions immediately as an obvious effort to intimidate academics, to squelch academic freedom. Petition of 800 scientists around the state. I didn't even realize there were 800 scientists in the state of Virginia, but a petition of 800 scientists from around the state of Virginia denouncing his attacks against us. Once again, AAAS, American Meteorological Society, the journal Nature, all editorialized on how this was clearly a transparent effort to intimidate scientists whose findings might not be convenient to the special interests that he represents. It also happens, coincidentally again, I'm sure, that Ken Cuccinelli is one of the largest recipients of fossil fuel money among U.S. governors, attorney generals. He was denounced, these actions were denounced even in conservative newspapers that had endorsed his candidacy. Washington Post wrote 5 editorials denouncing Ken Cuccinelli's witch hunt, as they called it. And even their award-winning cartoonist, Tom Towles, couldn't resist commenting on the matter, not once, but twice. This is my personal favorite, I have to say. Maybe hard for those of you in the back to see, but it's Ken Cuccinelli. He wants to see this guy's emails too. That's Galileo. I don't mind being compared to Galileo, I have to say. So it turns out that his subpoena was quashed by the lower court. He would argue based on a technicality. In his 40-page filing to the court, he had forgotten to provide evidence of wrongdoing on my part. And so it was thrown out by the court. He challenged to the state Supreme Court, which just ruled a couple of years ago, threw out the case with prejudice, meaning they really don't ever want to see an attorney general come back to them with something like this again. So that was a battle that was won, but the war continued on. Republicans were getting ready to retake control of the House of Representatives once again, and they telegraphed clearly what they planned to do. As soon as they took over the House of Representatives, they were going to hold a whole new set of show trials, witch hunt hearings, putting climate scientists like myself in the hot seat and denouncing us and attacking us. And I'm sure they would have gone through with it too, were it not for the fact that prominent members of their own party, once again, Sherwood Boehlert, who had now retired from the House of Representatives, he wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post where he warned his party, he warned his fellow Republicans that if they chose to go down that road, to abuse their authority, their newfound authority, to engage in witch hunt attacks against climate scientists, they would risk forever establishing their party, his party, the party he loves, the Republican Party, as the party of anti-science. And they better not go there. And it turns out they didn't. Those hearings never materialized. And I like to think it was because of the brave actions of people like Sherwood Boehlert that was the case. And so it leads me to this quote, Edmund Burke. Some of you may have seen this quote before. And what it really should read is that all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men and women do nothing. And fortunately in our story, I think it's clear that that didn't happen, that there were politicians of conscience on both sides of our political aisle, Republicans as well as Democrats, who came forward to defend science and to defend scientists when we were under attack. And that gives me some optimism that we will get past this bad faith debate we are currently stuck in American politics about whether climate change even exists. We have, rather than the House Science Committee that was led by Sherwood Boehlert, we currently have a science committee in our U.S. House of Representatives led by somebody who rejects the science of climate change and rejects the science of evolution. I have argued that temporarily we need to rename that committee. It is the House Anti-Science Committee for the current time. I think we'll get past that. Maybe sooner than we realize, and on to the worthy debate to be had about what to do about this problem. And Stefan already gave a very nice discussion, and so I won't go into the details. I'll just sort of make the point that, fundamentally, there is a worthy debate to be had about what policies to put in place to get us to where we need to go, to get us away from our reliance on fossil fuels so that we can avoid that dangerous warming of the climate. There's still time to do it. And arguably, everything should be on the table. Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and progressives should all be at the table. There's a room for conservative ideological approaches in this debate. And one of the reasons for optimism that I have is there's now a group of conservative Republicans who are arguing for conservative free market approaches to dealing with climate change. They're not rejecting the science. In fact, they're saying that there are approaches consistent with their conservative ideology, for example, revenue-neutral carbon taxes, where you put a tax on the emission of carbon, but you lower other taxes so that the net taxation of the American people doesn't go up. And so there's a worthy debate to be had there. And I think we're going to be moving in that direction in the years ahead. I am optimistic we'll get there. Finally, let me just end on this note here. Climate change is a problem that we typically frame as a scientific problem, as mostly we have here today, or a problem of economics. We can do cost-benefit analyses and look at different scenarios and apply laws of economics to evaluating how we get to where we need to go. Obviously, it's a matter of policy and politics. We often frame climate change in these terms, but I think as Gudni very nicely did early on, and Stefan touched on this as well, climate change, to me, is really, more than anything else, a problem of ethics, a problem of the ethical obligation that we have to future generations, our children and grandchildren, to not leave them a fundamentally degraded planet. It's an issue of intergenerational ethics. Now, this is a picture of my daughter at the Pittsburgh Zoo. And we're not torturing her, by the way. The polar bear is actually on top of her. At the Pittsburgh Zoo, you can walk through a plexiglass tunnel underneath the polar bear feeding pool. And if you happen to be involved in a NSF-sponsored project to develop climate change outreach for zoos and aquaria, and you know the manager of the zoo, you might be able to convince him to throw the fish in the pool when your daughter is walking underneath the tunnel, which is what's happening here. But on a serious note, the idea that my daughter could return to that zoo decades from now with her children and maybe her grandchildren, and point to these magnificent creatures and talk about how they used to exist in the wild, but we destroyed their environment. We literally melted their home. And of course, that's just symbolic of a much broader array of very dangerous and damaging impacts that climate change will have on the world that we leave behind, whether it's food resources, water resources, land, increased competition for these resources with an increasing global population, national security concerns, security issues because of increased competition among people for diminishing resources. One can easily envision a future that is not unlike some of the dystopian futures that Hollywood has depicted in movies like Soylent Green or Waterworld. In fact, there are reports that have been credible reports written by national security experts looking at worst case potential scenarios who depict futures that are not unlike some of those dystopian Hollywood futures. We have to make sure that that is not the future we leave behind for our children and grandchildren. Fortunately, as Stefan very nicely showed, there is still time to stabilize warming below dangerous and potentially irreversible climate changes. But there's a greater urgency now for action than there's ever been before. We need to act quickly. So thank you very much for your patience.